The MCU has given us some pretty awesome villains over the last few years, like Vulture, Killmonger, Ego, Mysterio, Loki, and of course, Thanos, which are some of the best written, best acted, and most fleshed out villains I've ever seen in superhero movies, at least over the course of the last decade, and Thanos himself has become one of the most iconic movie villains of all time. You might notice, however, that most of these villains were from Phase 3, which does make sense because for the first two phases, the Marvel movies were kind of infamous for mediocre and lackluster villains, some of which were even worse than that. There were characters like Whiplash and Malekith and Ronin and Aldrich Killain, and even Ultron was not nearly as good as he could have been. Now, you did have Loki, who was definitely a cut above the rest, but overall the first two phases didn't really have the strongest villains. The Marvel clearly got a lot better in Phase 3, but even now there are a couple villains post-Phase 2 that aren't great, but there's one who is genuinely terrible and the worst main villain the MCU has ever given us, and that's the newest one, Karli Morgenthau. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier's main villain is she's gotta be my most hated character in the MCU. I never despised the character as much as I despise Karli. That doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world on paper because she is the main villain and you're supposed to hate the villain, but that's clearly not what they were going for. If that is what they were going for and I ended up hating her as much as I do now, then they probably would have done a fantastic job creating such a hateable villain. But again, that's not what they were going for. They were going for a very, very sympathetic villain, and that was so clear. That was just shoved in your face the entire show. She was supposed to be sympathetic, but that's just not how she came off at all. I had no sympathy for the character, for her backstory, for her motivation, nothing. So what they were going for didn't work at all, and it wasn't conveyed well for so many reasons. And I'll go over them in this video. I'll talk about like why she didn't work, but also how she affected the show and the characters that surround her. Probably the most annoying thing about the character was her dialogue. Every single time that Karli talked, she basically said the same thing over and over again. She basically had the same repetitive and annoying conversation with every person she talked with, like saying things like, obviously her line, one world, one people, but also like we're fighting for the same thing, or they don't care about us, or like anything like that. It doesn't really matter. Every single conversation she had, she was saying the same things. She was talking to different people with the same exact lines, and it gets annoying. It gets really annoying really quickly. And the problem is they never attempted to expand on her argument. They never tried to show a different argument at all. She just said the same thing over and over again, and honestly, it was so annoying. But the peak of just the terrible dialogue for the character has to come from the finale, where she's on a phone call with Bucky and she says this:
"It doesn't matter if I don't survive this. I'm fighting for something bigger than myself. And with all the bodies you've collected, have you ever been able to say the same?"
Why?
But anyway, yeah, the writing for this character is just awful, and the actress honestly doesn't really do it any favors either. But another thing about the character that just doesn't work is her motivation, because we're only really ever told things, we're never shown anything. So throughout the entire show, we never once saw like how life was after the snap. All we've ever seen throughout the MCU, and it hasn't been much, but all we've ever seen is how genuinely depressing everything was, how terrible things were in between the snap and the blip, when people were snapped away and when they were brought back. Everything was terrible, because literally every single person in the world lost at least one person. The economy had to have collapsed, and obviously we learned that the borders collapsed as well. And that is an argument to say that that is better, I guess, but we've never seen any good side to the 5-year gap at all. So for them to come up now and tell us that there are characters who would say that they preferred how it was beforehand, it just doesn't work because we're never shown any of it. All they had to do was give us 1 or 2 flashback scenes, preferably more, of one, Karli's life before the snap, and then how she saw the snap. That I think would have been really cool. How she then learned to cope with the new world and even embraced it by creating something. The thing that she created, like the thing she built up along with all these other people now that there are no borders. And then how it all crumbled when people came back, and so did the borders. And that would have made her motivation just so much more reasonable and understandable. We could have connected to it so much easier. And I don't think it would have been all that difficult just to give us a couple flashbacks. instead of just telling us everything, because that just clearly did not work at all. I had no sympathy for her backstory or her motivation at all. It didn't connect with me whatsoever. I could not see any way that the world was better off beforehand. It just felt like, honestly, it was just chaos. All they just had to do was show us how it wasn't, and I think it would have been a lot more reasonable. Now, all of this really came together to make a villain that just was not sympathetic whatsoever, which is a damn shame because the show was pushing her sympathetic side really hard throughout the entire show. We're clearly supposed to at least be conflicted. Like, we're supposed to think maybe she's a good person, maybe she can be reasoned with. There are several scenes trying to make us care about her relationships, and with the rest of the Flag Smashers, with like Auntie Danya, who again, we're only ever told about when we never really see. But again, all of those scenes fall flat completely, mostly because they're not written well, they're not acted well, they don't hit the mark, especially when they try to portray her as sympathetic, and then she goes ahead and kills a dozen people in a terrorist attack just to have them listen, and after that they still try to portray her as sympathetic. I'm sorry, but she's just a straight up unredeemable villain. She's a terrorist and she needs to be stopped. There is nothing sympathetic about this person. And what's most frustrating about all of this is not the character herself. I think a show could go with having a terrible villain as long as it doesn't ruin the main plot and the main character, because at least you have those things. But the most frustrating part has to do with the main plot and the main character, who the terrible villain affected as well. Karli is the main driving force behind the plot, and there's no way around it. And it's really hard to care about the central conflict when the villain is just so poorly handled. This wouldn't be a problem if, say, like the hero had a good arc, or the villain wasn't really as important at driving the main force of the plot. But there really isn't any plot without Karli. It's just she's the plot. The plot is we have to stop the Flag Smashers, and that is it. And that part of the show always felt just so boring to me throughout its entire run. Everything else honestly was interesting. Like Isaiah Bradley's side plot was really, really great. Bucky's storyline with like overcoming his past and everything to do with all the people that he hurt in the past, that was very, very interesting. And honestly, my favorite part of the show had to do with John Walker, who was an extremely interesting character who really, really worked as this side antagonist with a great redemption arc, but probably could have worked even better as the main driving force of the plot and the main villain. I'll get back to that in a little bit. However, every single time we would go back to the Flag Smashers plot, which is the main one, mind you, I couldn't get invested. I completely lost interest in the show, and another huge reason for that has to do with the main character, Sam Wilson. The show is called The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so the Winter Soldier technically does have top billing along with Falcon, but it's pretty clear, much like WandaVision with Wanda, Sam is the actual main character while Bucky is the second main character, not really on par with Sam. And again, worst of all, the worst thing about all of this is how it all affected Sam. One of Sam's main character arcs involved his conflict with Karli. The conflict was probably the most frustrating thing I've seen in the MCU in a very long time, maybe ever, because no matter what she did, no matter how far she went, Sam just never refused to believe that she can be redeemed. He kept on with that notion she could be redeemed. She's a good person, she's just a bit misguided, and he never wavered from that whatsoever. This probably would have worked if she was a sympathetic villain, if she really had any sympathetic side to her whatsoever. But like I said numerous times, they failed to give us that, not for lack of trying. So when Sam kept on trying to reason with her, like even stopping Walker from just doing his job because Karli is quote-unquote like a good person, and then in the end refusing to call her a terrorist despite the fact that that's exactly what she is, it's so damn frustrating and makes Sam a much, much less likable lead character, and honestly made me dislike Sam more than I ever thought I could, despite the fact that he was super badass, he had this awesome costume, everything else about the character was mostly handled very well. Just the central conflict, the fact that he never wavered from this mindset that she could be reasoned with, it was just too naive and unrealistic for the character to really be. So, like, that's probably the worst thing about all this, how it made Sam less likable. This all came to a head in the final fight between Sam and Karli, and Sharon Carter was there as well, where Sam still refused to kill Karli. However, thankfully Sharon does it instead. This led to what just has to be the most satisfying, but at the same time worst handled death in the MCU ever, because obviously I hate the character, so I'm glad she died. But then they still portray her as sympathetic, trying to make us believe that this death was tragic somehow. You see the way that Sam is holding Karli at the end, like, yeah, this is a super tragic death, when that is the exact opposite of what it is. An incredibly annoying character who, in the continuity, in canon, is a terrorist, just died. It's not tragic. There's nothing tragic about this. Just it failed completely with the sympathy side, so they failed with the death as well, because what they were trying to convey just did not come across at all. So basically, yeah, this was not a tragic death. Karli was not a sympathetic villain. Sam was wrong in still trying to reason with her, and her entire message completely fell flat. All of this made for a weak arc for the main character, a boring main storyline for the show, and an overall poorly written, poorly acted, unsympathetic, attempted to be sympathetic villain who is probably, in my opinion, the worst villain in the MCU so far, but hopefully they'll never stoop this low again. So yeah, this was extremely disappointing to me. I was really looking forward to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier because I love the MCU, and Captain America, the whole trilogy, had to be my favorite trilogy from the MCU if you don't count the Avengers movies. So I was really looking forward to this, but in the end, I have to say The Falcon and the Winter Soldier is pretty mediocre. It's a low-tier Marvel Cinematic Universe property. I think all they really had to do was have John Walker be the main antagonist, because with him specifically, they basically succeeded at everything they were trying to do. At the beginning, he was supposed to be this very hateable antagonist, and he was. In the end, they tried to do a redemption arc, and they succeeded. So with him, they succeeded at everything they were trying to do. So if he was the main driving force of the plot, if he was the main antagonist, who in the end did still become an anti-hero or even a hero, I think the show would have been so much better off because of it. I am still looking forward to future Captain America projects like the recently announced Captain America 4. I do love Sam's suit, and I think I am still looking forward to the next Captain America outing. But unfortunately, his first outing as Captain America was bad. It was not a good one, in my opinion, at least mediocre, and he was honestly one of the weakest parts of his own show, even if he was pretty badass and his suit was awesome, just because of how unlikable he was with his conflict with the main villain. Anyway, that's basically my thoughts on the main villain of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier and the show itself. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you disagree with me, if you did like the villain, or you thought there was another MCU villain who is even worse, let me know in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.